name is Susan Pritchard, and I have the honor of leading out the presentation. Kayla is going to follow me, and then Paul is going to do the conclusion. So without further ado, we will start. So we're really excited to join you today about this project that actually started a number of years ago, probably based on some questions that we were getting from the media, as well as just other scientists as well, which is that we're seeing these trends of more wildfires, certainly in the West and other parts of the world. There's a clear linkage with climate change. But the question is also, what can we do about it? And so many of us in the fields of landscape fire ecology talk about the amazing departures that we've also witnessed in the area since settler colonialism and fire exclusion really began in North America. And so we're just starting this presentation with the reality that climate change and a radical change in how vegetation and fuels are available for fire are at play. Historically, the annual conterminous United States area burned estimate was 3 to 7 times higher than some of the worst years that we've had over the past decade. That's kind of amazing to think that we're actually still under fire exclusion in our country, even though we're experiencing all these fires. So Kayla put this slide together for us just to kind of show that throughout the Western United States, a lot of these forests had very frequent fires. So the fire regime group 1 in yellow and 3 low and in orange really are very, very dominant across this, indicating that a lot of fires in the past were dominated by low and moderate events. Certainly high severity fire occurred in all of these landscapes and fire regimes, but we've lost a lot of those low and moderate severity fires. We talk quite a bit about ponderosa pine. It's one of my favorite tree species, and we think about that often, these forests as being emblematic, along with oak woodlands, of severe fire departures. So exclusion of fire really changing them. But we're also seeing that this happened in cold forests, so the higher elevation forests as well. So as we're thinking about fire departures, one of the biggest and most concerning patterns that we're seeing around this is that maybe we're not getting the number or that area burned by wildfires that historically happened, but the wildfires that are happening are often at a much higher severity. This landscape is very close to where I live in north central Washington, not very far from where Paul Hesburgh lives as well. It's part of the 2014 Carlton complex. Basically, this fire burned at just a record-setting rate through dry forest lands. This is ponderosa pine country. You can see that the trees before the fire were quite crowded and dense, and the amount of stand replacement or high severity fire is pretty jaw-dropping in some of these landscapes and has implications for how these forests can recover, especially under warmer and drier conditions. I know that as we say this, those of you from the Southwest in California, Arizona, New Mexico, and elsewhere very much understand this because you're seeing some of these landscapes as well. So when we are actually asked by the media in particular, well, what led to these catastrophic wildfires, as some of people talk about? I've been really influenced by conversations with Kayla, Paul Hesburgh, Frank Lake, and others about the many different agents of change that have really led to the conditions that we're now experiencing. So first and foremost, settler colonialism contributed to not the whole cessation of indigenous burning by any means, but a very much of a restriction of cultural burning practices. Fire suppression policies really became effective after World War II, when more air resources were available, so 1940s. But before that, livestock grazing was a big factor. We see that in a lot of the tree ring records where there's a pronounced loss of frequent fire right around 1880, where widespread sheep herding and cattle grazing became common. See here in this kind of like charismatic megaflora photo of ponderosa pine here, the understory, the surface fields are dominated by grass. As you can imagine, if livestock grazing was really dominant in that forest, those grasses would not be there to be one of the primary carriers of fire. Road and rail construction played a role in stopping these low intensity fires sometimes in their tracks. High-grade logging preferentially took out the large, often fire-resilient species in individuals such as ponderosa pine, western larch, larger Douglas fir, and left some of the smaller, scragglier trees. And then finally, last but certainly not least, climate change is rapidly changing our fire seasons. This will be, again, very familiar story for so many of you, but I like this graphic that was created by Bob Van Pelt, showing the structure of a fire-maintained forest above that's patchy. So there's a lot of gaps within a canopy that could lead to less crown fire, and periodic fire basically reduces not only the seedlings that you see there, but the understory, the surface fuels that carry fire. Fire-excluded forests have gradually grown up. Some of those larger, more fire-resilient trees are now very vulnerable to drought. And there's that possibility of crown fire now if a surface fire starts in the forest understory. One of the pleasures that I've had in years of talking with Paul Hesberg is just appreciating just how much fires also modify and shape landscapes in the high elevations. And so here we see a photo of a 1936 view just east of Mount Rainier, I believe, showing this is patchwork of meadows and young and old forests that have then now by 2012, when this photo was taken, really filled in with a lot of forest cover. You can see that there's beetle attack. So I believe that this might have actually not been beetles, but western spruce budworm in this particular forest. So these forests are becoming more continuous hosts for sometimes insect outbreaks as well as fire. So some of the key observations that really led us to think about doing this three-part review was that we recognize that throughout Western North America, there's been significant fire deficit. Records of dendroecology, pollen and charcoal records all contribute to our understanding that fire has departed, as do traditional ecological knowledge. So there's a lot of alignment in many sources of information showing that we're under a significant fire deficit. And importantly, we wanted to emphasize in our review that this has not just happened at low elevations in classic frequent fire systems, but also at cold, higher elevation forests where fire might be less frequent at any one place in time, but the absence of fire over this period of time has led to an infilling of mature forest across landscapes. So I'm a really big fan of the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. It's an excellent framework to encourage multiple ownerships to and managers to work together to restore and maintain fire adapted landscapes. That's one prong of this three-legged stool. Build and maintain fire adapted communities and promote safe and effective wildfire response as needed. unfortunately, the reality is that even though we have this really great mechanism to communicate the risk of continuing a fire exclusion and the importance of scaling up treatments, restoration has not been keeping pace with the work of Western wildfires. Crystal Colden did this excellent review on the topic. We're not doing enough prescribed fire in the Western United States to mitigate wildfire risk. And here she shows that there's this steep trend in the area burned, as well as you can see oftentimes the severity of these fires by wildfires. Meanwhile, in this lower panel graph, we see that, yes, there are some regions on the southern geographic coordination center area where we're seeing an increase in prescribed burns. But all other regions, including the Western United States, have not seen this, even though there has been an increase in funding in some cases. I will just share that this frustrates me. I actually live in an area where a lot of my hikes where the fires have not burned look a lot like this. We still see these old fire-maintained ponderosa pines, but they have a lot of neighbors, especially Douglas fir, where I live. If we did have even a prescribed burn in some of these areas, it would be very hard to orchestrate, just because we now have ladder fuels from kind of fuel heavy. Here, I'm going to turn Leland off. So fuel heavy understory, and then plenty of layers of this forest to carry into the crowns. And so oftentimes in where I live, the treatment that's needed first could be either a very mild prescribed burn that picks away at this forest, or forest thinning first and then prescribed burning. So another thing that's frustrated me, and I could share that this also frustrates Paul and Keala, is that there's been quite a bit of a, I would call it a misinformation campaign. So campaign by some, certainly not all environmental groups, to question this increase in emphasis on restoration work. So in particular, some of the concerns are around thinning before prescribed burning, before fire can be reintroduced. And so here are just kind of two recent examples by our friend Chad Hansen about worrying that the work that's being done, say in this forest, is actually more of a ploy of commercial thinning. So that actually led me to talk with these close colleagues about the science is actually really clear on this topic of departures and supporting active management. Can we put together a set of 3 papers that managers and the public can really rely on to understand science-informed management and what we can do? And so I wanted to acknowledge that as we put this together, we reached out, especially Keala and I, to a number of potential funders, and we were really pleased to have diverse funders. So we have California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, Ecological Restoration Institute, Washington Department of Natural Resources, Wilderness Society, the Nature Conservancy of Oregon, Conservation Northwest, the Forest Service Pacific Northwest and Pacific Southwest research stations, and U.S. Forest Fish and Wildlife Service. I believe we had both the national as well as the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Office. So I'm going to be covering a lot of some of the 10 common questions paper, but I wanted to just share that Keala's paper actually fits in with the first question. And so that will be kind of our format, is that I will share some of our 10 common questions paper, but Keala will go with the question number 1. So our objective of the reviews really were, as I said, to emphasize and review the strength of evidence to counter some claims that this might just be a commercial timber grab and not necessarily necessary. And so we wanted to have our 10 common questions paper in particular provide evidence for some of the counter evidence that's out there in the popular media and some scientific articles. And then this is really important to all three of us, which is that climate change is daunting. The challenges that managers face are really daunting. And yet there are very really hopeful ways forward. And we wanted to end on that note. So with that, I'm not going to list these 10 common questions, nor do we have time to cover all of them. I will say that we're kind of front loading our presentation. And so Keala will take some time with question number 1, because it was the subject matter of an entire paper. I will take quite a bit of time on questions number 2 and 3, and then our pace will kind of be shortened so that we can give Paul some time. All right, with that, Keala, I will be your slide forwarder and take it from here.
All right, thank you, Susan. And good afternoon, everyone. As Susan reviewed, today's fuel loads and fire regimes reflect more than a century of policies that have favored the exclusion of fire, and the scientific evidence supporting that statement is strong. However, as she mentioned, a few particularly vocal scientists continue to argue the contrary. So we wrote this paper to present a review of the strength of the evidence and their counter evidence. Next slide, please. So the graph shown here illustrates the relative lack of fire since the late 19th century in tree rings collected from more than 800 sites across Western North America. That's one of many lines of evidence that inform our collective understanding of pre-fire exclusion conditions. Others, as Susan said, include sediment cores, indigenous knowledge, and early surveys, inventories, and aerial photos. These data sets span spatial scales from trees to landscapes and temporal scales from a single fire season to thousands of years. And they've been summarized in regional syntheses like those we feature in our paper, in all of our papers, and those shown here in the table, which you can find in our paper. They integrate multiple lines of evidence to gain insights and a degree of confidence that would be impossible to derive from any single line of evidence or scale. And these syntheses, as Susan said, support the management recommendations that she'll be reviewing to realign forests, landscapes with today's climate and wildfires. Next slide, please. Decades of challenges to this body of evidence have refined and strengthened it. Enormous amounts of time and resources have been invested to evaluate concerns that historical conditions were misrepresented, or that contemporary conditions are not departed from pre-fire exclusion. And despite repeated demonstrations of the strength of the evidence, some of the same people who raised challenges decades ago continue, as Susan said, to oppose ecologically, socially, and culturally credible management proposals and actions today. So to help others understand this 2-decade-long track record, we compiled a record of the counter premises and then the subsequent evaluation and rejection of those counter premises. What we've documented is a moving target of objections to proactive management that are supported by a body of counter evidence that is weakened by critical errors. Next slide, please. We began our review by presenting a framework for evaluating change in landscapes and fire regimes. As mentioned, evidence of change in a fire-dependent forest landscape is strongly supported by multi-scale, multi-proxy records. That's to say, many lines of evidence that span broad spatial and temporal scales. Change is evident, as these regional syntheses document, change is evident in multiple characteristics of forest and landscape structure and composition, as well as multiple dimensions of fire regimes. This depth of evaluation is necessary because change may not be apparent at all scales or in all dimensions. For example, a comparison of landscape level fire severity might show no change, but it might also mask change in the shape, size, or distribution of high severity fire patches. Among several lines of evidence featured in our paper is a landscape level study encompassing cold, moist, and dry forest types east of the Cascade Range in the Pacific Northwest. And that's what you see here on the right side of the slide. So that black outline there shows the area of this study, which is, as some of you may recognize, is an area that Paul Hesberg and his colleagues are very familiar with. Next slide, please. Aerial photos from this area, from the early and late 19th century document the expansion and densification of cold, moist, and dry forests. The outputs of a modeling study incorporating these aerials show how fire severity regimes changed over the past century. Essentially, the mixed and high severity fire regimes that now dominate the landscape, which you see on the right, now dominate a landscape that was predominantly low to mixed severity prior to fire exclusion, which you see on the left. Excuse me. This change in fire regimes is documented in numerous publications, and we compiled a list of these studies, similar studies for this paper, and Susan, in one of her slides, will point you to those tables. But observations like this continue to be documented in more recent publications. And I also want to note, as Susan alluded to, we focused on fire regimes in our papers, but we know that droughts, insects, and pathogens affect even more land than wildfire. And current conditions in these fire-excluded, fire-dependent landscapes are also more vulnerable to drought stress and insects and pathogen activity. Next slide, please. So that was a review of the evidence. To support our conclusion about the counter evidence that we reviewed, we compiled tables that list and summarize the counter premises and the counter evidence that were put forward. And we paired that counter evidence with publications from numerous independent lab groups that invested in evaluating it. So what you see here is a blow up of one of those comparisons with the counter evidence presented on the left and the paper that evaluated that counter evidence summarized on the right. There are 4 tables that review these documents. And again, repeatedly, counter premises and counter evidence were rejected due to the critical methodological errors that we summarized in these tables. Next slide, please. So lastly, I'd just like to give a shout out to Amy Waltz and Taylor Dubé at ERI, who took our papers and repackaged them in several different formats that make this information a lot easier to digest and summarize for diverse audiences. And one of the pieces they created is this table. It's a 2-sided, 1-page document of facts, myths, and fallacies that summarize some of the information in our paper. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Kayla. So I just wanted to say that as these papers have been in print for quite some time, it's been so gratifying to hear from many managers in particular how useful the tables that Kayla painstakingly put together have been. And I think one of the things that we could have mentioned and forgot to is that oftentimes when there are restoration plans that go through either an environmental assessment or an EIS, environmental impact statement, letters are, the public can comment, which is really important, but many times the letters in opposition to the restoration project cite that counter evidence. So having Kayla's tables so well organized and leveraging over 2-3 decades of the careful science that many of our colleagues did to counter that counter evidence has been very important. So thanks, Kayla. All right, So moving along, and as I said, the first question was a meaty one because it was the topic of an entire paper. And then questions number 2 and 3 are very related. So this first question is, can thinning alone mitigate wildfire severity? We wanted this one to be really upfront in our paper because it's kind of one of those claims that perhaps could be used by people with commercial interests in forest management. And so here we were questioning about if logging itself could actually reduce fire risk and do the restoration work without prescribed burning. This is a very convenient idea because it could potentially be a win-win. It makes money, it's commercially viable, and potentially could be used to mitigate fire risk. However, the science is very clear. We have a number of excellent reviews that have been published and peer-reviewed that show that in some cases, thin-only treatments, when they interact with a wildfire, are somewhat effective, but they're not necessarily the best option because prescribed burning is generally necessary to reduce surface fuels and really get to that mitigation of fire effects, so reducing the chance of a high severity fire. So here's just a beautiful set of images that John Marshall put together, showing in the Sinlahican Wildlife Area in northern Washington state, an example of a fire-excluded forest of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. Here, this forest has been thinned and then prescribed burned. And then the final picture that he was able to take was a photo of this site where it had survived really well a pretty large and often high severity wildfire in 2015. I've also witnessed a lot of thinning and prescribed burning units around where I live. And this is kind of the worst case of it, but it demonstrates the point pretty well, which is that thinning sometimes represents a rearrangement of fuels from the canopy to the surface. And so in this case, unfortunately, the contractor was not very diligent with a lot of their material. And so they thinned the forest so that it would avoid a crown fire. The trees are too well spaced to carry fire, but the surface fuels were ridiculously packed with fuels. Unfortunately, this unit, before they had time to clean it up, had a summer wildfire, and all the trees died, not because of crown fire, but because of that high intensity surface fire. All right, so as you've already seen, we like the idea of prescribed burning. It's one of the very best tools in our toolbox. So the question that we posed here was, can thinning and prescribed burning be done everywhere to solve the problem? And we really wanted to emphasize this because it is only one of the tools in our proverbial toolbox. So here again is a picture that I took near me. I wanted to explain why sometimes thinning combined with prescribed burning is so important. If prescribed fire managers brought fire into this forest, they'd have to do this on very marginal conditions. Otherwise, there would be a torching potential because there's so many layers to this forest canopy and a lot of accumulated surface fuels you cannot see. It would be great to just bring prescribed fire, cultural fire to these landscapes, but sometimes thinning is necessary. I do want to mention that we were very careful in our review and are careful in our words to not say that prescribed burning is the same thing as cultural fire stewardship or cultural burning. This quote by Bill Tripp is a beautiful one that you can read here about some of the very big differences that could be between a prescribed fire for potentially fuel reduction purposes and fire as a sacred practice. So really appreciate some of the guidance we have from our Indigenous colleagues. Another point that we wanted to make is that thinning and prescribed burning, or even prescribed burning on its own, might not necessarily be the tool that is needed up in the high elevations. And so here we have some pictures of examples to explain, especially why thinning and prescribed burning are not necessarily the effective tools. First of all, many of our high elevation subalpine tree species, such as lodgepole pine, Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, and many other true fir species, have thin bark. And so if you could imagine, you might be able to thin a forest to reduce that crown fire. But once you apply a prescribed fire, these trees have very thin bark and might not even survive the prescribed fire. And so it's done in some cases. Prescribed operational crown fires are a great tool to restore patch mosaics. But these are the landscapes where we'd be really looking for opportunities for intentional higher severity patches or moderate severity patches to do work, whether that's through unplanned ignitions that are managed for resource benefit, or cultural burning practices, or possible prescribed fires that were set intentionally to restore this mosaic. All right, I promised you we would start moving through some of these questions a little faster. Question number 4 comes up a lot, and this is that, well, we understand that fuel reduction treatments are necessary and work well, but why don't we just concentrate them around where houses are and then let nature do its work out in the wildlands? And so the question is, should active forest management, including forest thinning, be concentrated in the wildland-urban interface? This comes up in the scientific literature and often in the media and responses to restoration treatments that might go larger. This is just one example from the Wildfire of how some treatment areas that were fairly close to the wild interface were really important as a buffer from a high intensity crown fire at the top of this ridge to then transition through the treatment and then protect a residential area. This is kind of a compressed example, but I think it's important to mention that sometimes going beyond just the immediate interface of homes and wildland interface is really important, because you can allow for more options. So firefighting to put in a defensive burnout, or for a crown fire to drop on the surface and be less damaging. I've done quite a bit of research in North Central Washington on effective fuel treatments. The research projects that I did were in the Carlton Complex fires and Tripod Complex fires in particular. In both of these cases, the treatments were not necessarily near homes nor near communities. And yet we've seen that some of these patches, here's just one of an old clear-cut block that was actually broadcast burned before it was planted, and here an older, thin, and prescribed burn, being far away from communities, and yet they're surrounded by a sea of dead trees and now have viable seed source and habitat. They're creating some of the mosaic in what otherwise was really a high severity event. And so in this case, we could say that they were refugia. And then finally, Kiala actually added this slide, and I really love it, which is that we're not just talking about fuel reduction treatments. We're often talking about forest restoration, and forest restoration to create more resilient wildlife habitat, especially watersheds and places where habitat can survive and thrive even under reintroduction of fire. All right, question number 5. This has to do with kind of question number 4 with the wildland urban interface, where some might argue, well, why don't you just allow nature to do its work out in the wildlands? And we've really talked a lot about this, which is that the type of wildfires that we're getting out in the wildlands are not necessarily what you could call natural. They're driven by anthropogenic climate change. They're driven by very different fuels and fire regimes from the cessation of cultural burning practices in many areas, not all. And so our answer to this is that wildfires are sometimes doing excellent restoration work, but not always. And so Kiala, once again, meticulously documented this question in her first paper. And so I'm just going to point you to that if you do see these arguments and want to see quite a bit of the counter evidence to them, Kiala has that for you in her table number 2. She's basically showing that high severity fire is becoming more common, and it's very departed from what historically happened in many, not all of our ecosystems in the Western United States and Canada. So we are seeing these trends of high severity fire, and I just wanted to mention 2 really good articles. Sean Parks and John Abatsoglu published one in 2020, and Megan Singleton has a really good one from the Southwestern United States that we wanted to share from 2015. Moving along. Question number 6, is the primary objective of field treatments to contain wildfires? This question was really important to me because Elizabeth Reinhart actually posed it in her 2008 paper on field reduction treatments, and it's still very relevant today. So the question here is that it's actually kind of a circular one. Do we put in field reduction treatments in order to just stop wildfires from burning? And so our answer to this is an important one because it's coming up even in court cases. So in the 9th District Court of Appeals, I think my little photo is in the way, ruling against a forest restoration project, the decision, prevailing decision said, it is becoming more and more commonly accepted that reducing fields does not consistently prevent large forest fires and seldom significantly reduces the outcome of these large fires. We disagree. So what I'm showing here is a beautiful example, beautiful individual here too, Eric Knapp, showing an example of how this particular treatment did not stop a wildfire, nor was it designed to. So in this example from Northern California, Eric Knapp is standing at exactly the dividing line between a high severity crown fire and a past treatment, a thinning and prescribed burn that required the fire, if it was going to continue to move, to drop down to the surface and had very different effects. So a lot of the trees survived in this treatment. This is actually what a lot of fire ecologists are really arguing for, is that field treatments are not there to stop wildfires, but change the very nature of fire when they do go through a restored forest, so that a lot more trees survive and the more habitat features are maintained. Here's another example. I love this one. This is Todd Cam from Tonasket Ranger District talking with Lonnie Costin from the Confederated Tribes of the Colville. They're both fire management officers. They're talking about the 2015 North Star fire that was quite devastating for the tribes as well as our communities around us, and a set of treatments that had been both thinned and prescribed burned that were actually used then to corral the wildfires. And so this is actually an example of where treatments allowed fire managers to get in and do a prescribed burn in the middle of summer that was yet another restoration treatment and guided the fire away from communities and away from highly valued resources. And then the fire marched on to different parts. All right, question number 7, another one that has been coming up again in court cases is maybe we shouldn't really invest so much time and money into field treatments because they don't even necessarily work under extreme fire weather. This is concerning because with climate change, we're having more chances of the confluence of lightning, wind, and extreme fire behavior. So it is definitely one to look at. Kiala put together a really nice summary of recent examples: the Bootleg Fire in Oregon, 2013 Rim Fire in California, 2011 Las Conchas Fire in New Mexico. All of these examples had examples of truly extreme fire weather moving through landscapes and having a lot of high severity effects, and yet treatments still worked. I also really wondered about this with the Carlton Complex fire. We did see some areas where fires were truly devastating, both to communities as well as to what could have been resilient ponderosa pine ecosystems. And yet here, we were seeing that this progression day actually burned 157,000 acres of forest land, mostly in one day. Well, actually half forest land, I should say. And what we found when we did a retrospective analysis of field treatments is that treatments, again, I'm in the way here, that were both thinned and underburned had a lot more of their area that were burned as either unburned patches or low severity in this event than any of the other treatments. So thinning and unburned treatments were worth it. They didn't always work, but they would definitely allowed a lot more of the area to survive. Another question that comes up is that we're behind. We have so much work to do. Is the scale of the problem too great? Will we ever catch up? Sometimes this actually comes up in legal challenges too. And I'm sorry, I'm on my laptop and I'm really struggling to find my quotes. So once again, in the Bark versus United States Forest Service decision, it actually says field treatments are unlikely to reduce fire severity and consequent impacts because often the treated area is not affected before by fire before fuels return to normal levels. So that's a drop in the bucket argument, saying, well, we can't treat enough of this landscape to make a difference. And I think that our answer to that is that we absolutely have to scale up our treatments to meet this problem. It's possible, but we have a lot of work to do. We're seeing with the scientific evidence is where we do actually treat fuels, they do make a difference. We're just not actually treating at the scale to make a difference yet. Question number 9. This actually came from Crystal Colden. She really wanted us to bring it in with the question about tree planting because forests do sequester a lot of carbon and can they be used for offsets? We're very concerned about this argument in fire country because it works well in urban areas and we're really excited to see more urban forests for a lot of reasons, and they can be part of the carbon sequestration solution to some extent, but we can't actually rely on a lot of our western forests to do this work. We're probably looking at actually reducing total above ground carbon stocks in many of these forests to stabilize carbon loads rather than actually increase carbon storage and sequestration potential. It's just kind of the hard truth with where we're at with climate change and longer, drier, hotter, and more severe fire seasons. So we're hoping that more conversation happens around this, that we might actually need to reduce some of the overall carbon to stabilize some of these forests and have them not actually just burn at high severity so much of the time. And then the final question, and I'll move on to Paul then. Question 10, is post-fire management needed or even ecologically justified? This question came up because as with myself, I had a lot of concerns about salvage logging. And so there's some questions about, well, once you've had a fire, do you really need to do more? And one of the answers to that is that if a forest actually really does have a lot of trees in it and could use thinning before a fire, it might actually need to be thinned following the fire so that when those trees that are killed by the fire inevitably fall down, they do not become fuel for a high intensity reburn. This is a picture that Camille Stevens-Ruman shared with us from Central Idaho, where we actually see a very large landscape that had a high intensity reburn. Big issues for seed stock once these areas that are too full of post-fire fuels burn. And so some of the question around post-fire management is really needed. And so we underscore that in our paper. So additional resources are here. We're happy to share this presentation. And with that, I will stop sharing and let Paul Hesberg take the stage.
Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate the background that you and Keala have provided. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And is that coming through okay?
That looks great.
Yes.
All righty. So my assignment is to draw together the great findings that Calla and Susan have brought forward. Yeah, my screen seems to have a mind of its own. Please hold. And what I'd like to do is sort of summarize what the case is for intentional management now in the context of forests that have changed quite significantly and a climate that is now rapidly shifting. So I want to start by summarizing what actually is the case for intentional management. We know that fire regimes are markedly changed, and here I want to put that in the context that Calla's paper puts that in. There are many aspects of fire regime. I urge you to take a look at that table documenting the facets of fire regimes. Any significant change in one of or more of those factors constitutes a significant change in regime. So please take a close look at that. She's also documented the forest conditions changes. And in many areas, they're quite remarkable, including in our high elevation, colder forests. So also take a look at that evidence in Calla's paper. You know that the climate's progressively warming, and with continued increases in greenhouse gases that are also being forced by significant fires throughout Western North America, this is also increasing greenhouse gases. So it's not just other sources, it's also wildfire emissions as well. We know that many wildfires are now uncharacteristically large, and at least portions of them are really quite intense. We've done a survey of fires in Oregon, Washington, and California, which you can see on the right side there. And when we look at the monitoring trends in burn severity, and for more recent ravage maps from more recent fires, what we find out is at least half of that area is in high intensity burns. And in my last point, I'll talk about what we're finding with the low and moderate severity fire effects. We know that regeneration to forest is especially uncertain with large patches of high severity. And often when regeneration happens, it might be with the seed reign of the species we actually want to move away from, either because it's not climate change adapted or it's not tolerant of fire. So we're seeing forests disappear in some places. We're also seeing forests reobtain that are heavily affected by the shade tolerant seed reign that we worry about. We know that fuel reduction tools work, and they're really appropriately applied to the conditions as they vary across the landscape. Susan discussed in some detail how to combine thinning and prescribed burning, when prescribed fire alone works, and some opportunities for managed wildfires in backcountry, especially as we have adequate burn planning associated with those conditions. Finally, low and moderate severity wildfire effects are often restorative. When we look at the data for the last decade, we're averaging about 7 million plus acres of wildfire burned area, and about half of that area, Mas or Minas, tends to be lower moderate severity. And if you think about that, that's a pretty good or better first entry fire. So the question becomes, are we doing good work with those first entry fires? Here, I attract your attention to Derek Churchill's lab and a paper he recently published on post-fire landscape evaluations, how to assess whether good work or poor work is coming out of contemporary fires. And Dr. Alina Kanzler also did a really nice paper recently on previous wildfires and management treatments and how they influence subsequent fire severity. All right, I want to pounce on the climate change evidence a little bit. It's extremely important, and we're finding out it's shifting very broadly, and the shifts are different by geographic setting. But what we're finding out is that more extreme climate and fire weather is increasing large burned area. And if you think about it, the energy for fire intensity is coming out of fuels, but the climate and the fire weather are making that fuel available to burn and spreading those fires. And so there's a strong connection between changing forest conditions and this new climatic context. But it wasn't always that way. This is just a first paper that came out from a colleague of ours, Alan Taylor's lab, and working with Valerie Truitt and Scott Stevens and Carl Skinner's lab. And this is a really cool paper. I encourage you to go and look it up. It came out in 2016. And it talks about indigenous cultural burning over the period of record where trees are recording fires, weakening the climate relationship to area burned in the Sierra Nevada for this period of 400 plus years before today. And they saw that the climate amplified large fire activity only resumed after significant indigenous depopulation. And since Allen's papers came out, there's been several others from Western North America and Canada in particular that have also that are documenting these in the Nature of Review articles, that indigenous cultural burning was a significant influence on fire size and fire behavior, in addition to lightning-caused ignitions. And we know in the current instance that the global temperature is being heavily influenced by greenhouse gas emissions. And here we see a late 1800s record to the present day, and we see that change in global temperature is strongly correlated with changes in these greenhouse gas emissions. I also want to bring to your attention these two traces here. In the top trace, you see global mean temperature change, and you can see on the left axis that we have temperatures degrees C. I want to attract your attention to when the medieval warm period occurred from a global perspective and when the Little Ice Age occurred. In the Northern Rockies and the Okanagan Highlands and the Northern Cascades, this was the realization of those same medieval warm and Little Ice Age periods. And so to put it into context, most of our information and insight about forest conditions, where species make a living, and what's happening with climate and wildfire comes from a post-Little Ice Age climate and a resumption of non-Ice Age weather conditions. And that's not a small factor when you think about the current climatic changes. So the Little Ice Age climate left fuel and fire and forest conditions in one kind of space, but under current climate change, these conditions are not well adapted. Let's take a look at some of the projected changes in US temperatures by mid-century. And here we're looking at changes by season, if you will, but for the 1981 to 2010 average period and the 2060 to 2069. And these are projections from the high emissions RCP 8.5 scenario. And these are projecting average daytime high temperatures. And one of the things that you really notice across the country is that not only are summer seasons getting hotter and warmer, but the shoulder seasons are getting hotter and warmer. And so we're seeing very significant changes in the length of winter, the length of spring and fall, and the summer wildfire season. Here's a look at annual temperature that is comparing, and precipitation here in the bottom, that is looking at 30-year normals compared to 1901 to 2000 period. And what you can see is in this comparison, the difference from the average in temperature as you increase in decades is that the temperature is steadily rising. Precipitation is also rising, but it's not in many geographic areas keeping pace with the warming. So it's getting hotter and drier, and it's not becoming moister. We're having more periods of the year when fuels are available to burn, and larger fuels are becoming available to burn. It's not just in the continental US. As you move north into British Columbia, some of Tong-Li Wang's projections are showing the same future for British Columbia. And in fact, projections throughout North America are showing that the coastal areas of British Columbia and Washington State and California and Oregon and the northern climes in the subarctic and Arctic are actually warming at a faster rate than we're seeing, for example, in Washington State or Montana. What does it mean? It means that northern hemisphere summers are moving in the direction of nearly half of a year being in a summer moisture condition. And what's being pinched out is the winter and the length of spring and fall shoulder seasons. So what are some climate change strategies that we might look at? You've seen many versions of adaptation strategies, and you can pick your favorite one. We're choosing here to talk about these three simple guiding rules: resist, guide, and accept. Resist means to actively restore resilient structure and composition in support of the kind of disturbance regimes you want to live with. Under guide, we're adapting forests to a warmer and drier future. This is essentially where we're knowing that climatic water deficit is not going to be the same as 20th century deficit conditions, and some of the communities of interest in forest types are going to be shifting in leading and trailing edge forest conditions. The opportunity there is to guide those transitions rather than take potluck from wildfires. Finally, with the accept strategy, some of these transformations are not only inevitable, but we're going to see transition out of forest conditions, and we have the opportunity to actually facilitate them, again, using some of the existing tools we have, looking at potential and actual evapotranspiration and differencing them to get climatic water deficit. Increasing the speed and area of adaptive management according to these principles as they spatially lay out on the land is going to require a number of strategies, and they're going to be applied to the conditions as they're warranted. So sometimes it's going to be thinning and or prescribed burning as the conditions warrant. And Susan did a really nice job of laying out how you might decompose that problem to determine which tool to connect. Revitalization of indigenous cultural fire stewardship is a big deal. In many ways, Western science is just plain discovering and rediscovering many of the things that have been known for millennia. So there's not only an opportunity to bring cultural fire stewardship into the mix, but actually to yoke our best efforts in Western science and in cultural fire stewardship. We have the opportunity to use managed wildfires under moderate fire weather and fuel conditions. Increasingly, we're going to the field and monitoring where that's been done. I love to do that, especially in the wintertime, because I can see the fire effects in a year or two after the fire, best in snowy conditions. We have the opportunity to do proactive post-fire planting and silviculture to enhance resilient structure and composition of future forests. And here I draw your attention to some of the work of Andrew Larson's lab, Alina Kanzler's work, Derek Churchill's work on post-fire evaluations. Finally, we had the opportunity to restore resilient patch dynamics. And if you stop and think about it, one of the biggest upgrades in our thinking is that we've gone from some notions of sort of stable and equilibrium sorts of ecosystems in the past. Many of us were taught those in school, but in fact, these landscapes have been dynamic since time immemorial. And we're just learning that not only are dynamics how these landscapes work, but also the dynamics themselves shift over space and time. So it's important for us to think in terms of restoring resilient patch mosaics in the context of the current climate and changing climatic conditions. And then finally, active monitoring and learning as we go along. We don't know everything we need to know, and so much of our management should be thought of as experimental, which means we know about the conditions before and after and understand the extent to which our work is being successful or where it's imprudent and requires modification. I want to draw your attention to Andy Gray's and Whittier's study from 2014 here, where they show that between 1994 and 2007, carbon stocks increased in Eastern Oregon and Washington, but the increase occurred in dead wood stocks. The dead wood stock increases actually exceeded those of the live trees. This is some cool work from James Johnston's lab, where he worked with others to evaluate conditions in the Blue Mountains. And you can see the forest species here: Western large ponderosa pine, Western white pine, Douglas fir, grand fir, lodgepole, Engelmann spruce, and juniper. And what they looked at for these two periods, 1880 and 2016, by these size classes is change in basal area by species. And they also then, for these same periods, looked at the percentage differences in basal area. And the fact is, they're finding out forests are not only denser, but the changes in trees per acre in basal area are actually occurring increasingly in shade-tolerant species. Here's some other work that Andy, who's a co-author in these two papers, did using FIA data. And here he's showing in Eastern Oregon and Washington on national forest lands, other public lands, and on private lands, that grand fir, white fir, and Douglas fir increases in basal area in size classes exceeding 40 centimeters DBH are essentially accounting for the greatest increases in live tree basal areas. So the shade tolerance, not only in trees per acre, but also in basal area, is where shade tolerant species is where we're seeing our forests growing right now. This is a very significant observation. All right, what are some strategies for adapting Western North American landscapes? The first one we would posit from the excellent work of dozens of laboratories that we had the honor of being able to review and to summarize is that we can conserve forests by planning for future ranges of variability. We're literally considering what the climate is doing in the context of altered forest conditions and do the work that actually will transition those conditions into that forest, that future climate condition. We find that the options are declining rapidly, and they're declining for most geographies that we study, and that regional to province scale adaptation is needed. And all of the tools, a large toolkit, is going to be required for that. The thought process behind that is really well shown in the Hagman and Pritchard reviews. We recommend using the resist guide and adapt models or some form of them. There are about a half a dozen of them out there that are published. And very large landscapes need attention. What we're finding out from the past several decades is that projects that lead to treating stands here and there across a large watershed are mostly being missed. Those treatments are being missed by current wildfires, and it's because the footprint of those treatments is insufficient to change how fires percolate through the landscape and how bug outbreaks percolate through the landscape. So there needs to be large scale in restorative and adaptive projects, and there's a need to quicken the pace. We recommend here, it's also important that we think of this in managed and wildland landscapes. This map here shows the Western United States, and you can read the legend, the differences between federal general forest, wildlands, national park lands, and then other non-federal forests. And what you can see is an awful lot of the landscape is in wilderness and roadless areas, and fire suppression has had an active hand in influencing them, those wildlands. And in fact, those wildlands are sending fires to the managed landscape and to the wildland urban interface in ways that we really don't want to live with in the future. So we'd suggest that the time is short. We're expecting, using the recent climate literature, that there's a 2- to 4-fold increase in area burned by 2050. And given current climate and fuel relationships, we expect that at least half of that is going to be burned by severe fire or more. A second set of ideas is that the nested character of large landscapes hold vital adaptation clues. And here I draw from many laboratories' work to suggest that there's several scales at which to concentrate activities on rebuilding resilience. Fine spatial scale that uses species traits and life history adaptations to influence how fires can burn at patch and patch neighborhood and individual tree scales. And a great example is the ICO treatments, the individual clump and opening treatments pioneered by Derek Churchill's lab and other labs throughout the Western US. Working at the mesoscale to develop successional patchworks that can influence future fire frequency and severity is also important, because if you think about it, these patchworks, this heterogeneous patchworks, form the percolation surface where disturbance propagates. And so you get to influence how flame length and active and passive crown fire can happen on the landscape by manipulating those patchworks. And finally, there are strong cross connections between broad non-forest and forested patchworks, where here I'm thinking of wet and dry meadows and grasslands and shrublands, and then varied successional patchworks. At each of these scales, resilience lives, and adaptation of the landscape really requires this multi-layered thinking. All right, some recommendations. We recommend in planning and management, we think about whole landscapes and multi-scale adaptation. And by whole landscapes, I'm really talking about prescriptions for large landscapes, not stand management. We use the silvicultural and fire tools that we're all familiar with, but we develop prescriptions for successional conditions, non-forest conditions that promote the fire regime of interest. We continue to conserve large and old fire-tolerant trees and grow more of them. Most of the landscape studies show us that large trees were the major depredation of the early 20th century and late 20th century timber harvest. So the goal is living and dead to make more large old trees and redistribute them on the landscape again. And that's a centuries-long task ahead of us. On dry and moist mixed conifer and pine forests, create open canopy, clumped and gapped tree patterns. There are now studies that are published that show us that these clumped and gapped tree patterns also extend into moist mixed conifer landscapes as well. Not all, but some of them. This is likely not as true in some of the wettest moist mixed conifer forests. Also creating heterogeneous cold forest. Some of the work from our reburn modeling and from our landscape reconstructions show us that across many provinces, cold forests were patchworks of burned and recovering areas and varied successional conditions. And our reburn modeling is showing us that having wet and dry meadows and shrublands in cold forest areas actually was a throttle and a fire severity control. And so we had temporally mixed severity conditions in our cold forest as a consequence of these burn and recovering patchwork areas. Another recommendation is to create and maintain successionally heterogeneous forest. I've covered that previously, but I'd like to add to that increasing wetland areas, riparian and hardwood areas, is a part of that heterogeneity that we wish to obtain. The second to the last point is to look at recreating fine meso and broad scale physiognomic patchworks of these forest and non-forest conditions. We find them at every spatial scale, and they're critical to the flow and severity of fire across the landscape. And we now have some pretty cool climatic water deficit and AET products, actually evapotranspiration products, to guide our decisions in future climates. So it's be helpful in actually facilitating some of these transitions. And finally, apply a topographic template to rebuilding these non-forest and forest successional patterns. We've shown in the inland Northwest that aspect and topographic position are strongly influential to forest type and the kinds of fire regime that you get. Carl Skinner's lab showed that down in the Klamath country, topography worked another way, that summer inversions were characteristic. And so what happened above and below the inversions in terms of patterns of fire and their behavior was altered. We know that topography is an important template, but its geographic role also varies. All right, I wanted to leave up these additional resources, and that ends my formal comments. If folks are interested in that, and I'm assuming, Rachel, that PDFs of the talks will be available so folks can tap into those as well, yeah?
Yes, they will.
All righty, at this point, I'll stop sharing and open up the floor to questions. Is it the timing for that?
It's a great time. I'd like to kick it off by thanking you all so much for the excellent presentations that you just ran through. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion period as well. So we'll go ahead and start with a question that came a while back from Myrna. They asked, with the application of prescribed burning, is there a risk of increased invasive plant cover in the forb layer? For example, a large concern is the increased establishment and spread of downy brome. With your recommendation of applying prescribed burning, is this consideration being given to invasive plant spread?
Susan, do you want to kick off and I can follow up?
Yeah, I can. I think that all of us are deeply concerned about the spread of non-native invasive grasses. Many of them, as you well know, can increase the chance of frequent fires, so there can create a grass fire cycle. So it's a really good question, and one that would be very place-based in our responses. What we've noticed in a lot of the areas that we've been studying is that where there hasn't been a lot of agricultural, past agricultural or grazing, we're not seeing necessarily an increase in cheatgrass or other non-native grasses coming in after prescribed burning. Rather, a lot of the native plants, such as shrubs and herbaceous, are rebounding really brilliantly. And so there is that kind of question about how resilient are your native plants currently on site, and then what is the non-native seed source? And so again, that's a really place-based question. Paul, do you want to continue?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is that there's really a significant trade-off between a non-characteristic fire with the resumption of an active fire regime, difference in the non-native response to a severe fire, one that's severe for the forest type versus one that's more characteristic of the active fire regime. In those two thought experiments where non-natives are present, we see the non-native response being more significant in the severe fire and less in the lower fire severity. But it's a non-trivial consideration in as the climate change and more sites are going to become drier as a consequence, and those conditions migrating up the hill, we expect to see consequences for non-natives. So paired solutions are going to have to be important. But I think the backdrop for that question is, do you want the outcome for non-natives that's associated with more severe or less severe wildfire? Because that is an important accounting as well.
I'll say one more thing, and it relates to Travis's question about we chose to talk about resist, guide, and accept, and certainly we could have, as Paul indicated, used more of a resist, accept, direct framework. The RAD framework is common too. And so Travis, the answer to that is that they're different words, same concept for sure. But when it comes to non-native grasses, I think that we're already in that guide sort of framework, and it's frustrating for me because I don't want to accept that the non-natives are probably here to stay in many of our ecosystems. And so, as Paul said, we might need to work with them and then think through trade-offs between severe fires that could further erode forests if we want forests, and further exacerbate the non-native assemblage.
All right, I really appreciate that answer, and it really gets at the complexity of making these management decisions, as well as the importance of collaboration. So Susan had a question. Does your observation that treating very large landscapes rather than smaller disconnected portions of a watershed support or contradict the commonly repeated understanding that we need to treat 30 to 40% of a landscape to alter the fire behavior or fire impacts?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm thinking about a couple different ways to answer it, but I think that Paul alluded to our reburn modeling framework, and that shows us that it's something that I would love to come back at some point and give another presentation on if there's time for it. But basically, we're exploring through simulation modeling this exact idea that patches of forest, non-forest, and different ages of forest and kind of receptivity to fire really create a lot of resilience on a landscape. And certainly that kind of often cited adage of you need at least 30 to 40% of an area treated to make a difference for fire outcomes is in play. So I don't know that that guide is always necessary, but what I would say is that there's an issue with too small of postage stamp units. And the reason why is that if you have a very large fire event, so imagine like a running crown fire with a column of smoke that might be 20, 30,000 feet in the air and bent over with wind, a small treatment unit might not actually make it. because it might even just be preheated by that smoke. And so the spatial scale of treatment that we keep on talking about needs to be larger so that hopefully there's more area that has a chance of survival. So I would say that if you really had a thought experiment of lots of small postage stamps, that might work, but we're talking about maybe larger patched mosaics. Paul, did you want to answer any of that too?
Yeah, it's a great answer. A couple thoughts to maybe append to that. Mark Finney's lab's done some really cool work in the past. In the early part of the 2000 to 2010 period, where he took a look at spatial optimization of fire treatments, and if you could spatially optimize them, what kind of effects might you get on the landscape? And he was looking at numbers in the 20 to 25, maybe 30% territory if you could spatially optimize. And that's under the governing assumption that set-asides on the landscape are not at issue, and you have the ability to drive your treatments on the landscape through spatial optimization. On most managed landscapes, that's quite a difficulty. And so what he found out is placing treatments on the landscape, you literally had to treat a much larger area if you couldn't spatially optimize. And as Susan said, it's geographically specific, but these interactions between multi-scale resilience concepts are critical to have in place to determine what is the scale of treatment. And on landscapes where fire's been excluded for 100 to 150 years, what we're really looking at is a landscape that's dominated by a percolation surface. That is a surface that warrants the spread of severe fire because dead wood, fuel ladders, and high canopy bulk density all live together in a highly connected landscape. You start to unpack that and change those relationships, and the amount of the landscape that you have to treat and maintain over time significantly changes. But the baseline assumption is you have to have an active fire regime working in the background, allowing these fire-on-fire interactions at normal periodicities to be able to maintain the landscape. I too, Susan, would love to do a reburn talk with you where we can talk about what we're learning with fire-fire interactions and how they're kind of the secret sauce of resilient landscapes. Matt Hurtaugh's lab's got a really cool question. Can we nab that one too?
Yeah, absolutely. I was about to say that we're probably going to have too many questions and not enough time. But first off, great to see the folks from Matt Hurtaugh's lab. They asked, with worsening fire weather during shoulder seasons, how do we talk about the increased risk of prescribed fire to a public that gets angry or exasperated when these fires escape and become uncontrolled wildfire? And they're referring specifically to interactions with people in New Mexico after the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fire that occurred up in northern New Mexico, but also with an expectation that this will become a bigger problem in the future.
Hey, Alla, you haven't answered any questions yet. That seems like a really difficult one. Do you want to take it first?
I'm not sure I'll have much to say, but I will give it a chance. But I do want to say that we use shorthand in referring to these three papers as Susan's, Paul's, mine. But these papers wouldn't exist without the dozens of colleagues that joined us in creating them and promoting them. So I want to shout out all of those people.
Amen.
Yeah, you know, you guys are on the front line there, Hurtaugh Lab and ERI, and so you probably have a great deal more experience with it than I do. I can only imagine that we just have to keep reiterating that this is so far is a tiny percentage of the fires that do burn. And Susan and Paul, I'm sure you have more to say about that.
I was going to say to the Hurtaugh Lab, carefully when you're in New Mexico. You speak about it carefully. But all kidding aside, we really have to weigh in balance in management and policy environments, what really the trade-offs are, and to be really clear about them and to use clear language and many of the tools to basically say, how do you want your fire? That fire is returning to your neighborhood is not an open question anymore. It's coming. And so the question is, you can create conditions whereby fires will occur in a more desirable fashion, leaving a more desirable forest conditions, or no, you can take pot luck. And part of the cool part of the question from Matt's lab is that, as we said in our talk, shoulder seasons are getting shorter and snowpacks are declining, and the period of winter is declining, and the rate of snowpack attenuation is accelerating, winter, spring. And so when is the burn season, and how do you appropriately do that? And my answer to that is that we do a better job of burn planning, better understand what our fuel conditions are, and we put across those landscapes anchor and control places where we can hook, hold, release, and turn fires on that landscape in a much better prepared landscape than we're currently doing prescribed burning on. And that means getting to scale in terms of treatments across that landscape, treating more area so that you actually have options throughout that landscape in case the fire takes a walk, to be able to stop the walk.
And I'm going to follow up on this really quickly. I appreciate your answer, but the other side of it is, I think, something that we all dance around, which is taking advantage of naturally ignited fires when they're burning in the right places and under the right conditions. And, it's sort of still a gray space with federal agencies, but how do we start having that conversation with the public about natural ignitions that are managed for resource objectives?
Is it okay if I start on that one, Paul, or would you like to?
Hit her down.
Okay, we've talked about this quite a bit, and one of the things that I would love to do as a community is figure out a way to describe these unplanned ignitions that are allowed to burn as another type of prescribed fire. So basically, when there is an opportunity for a lightning strike to burn in a particular location and under a prescribed weather and smoke scenario, that is a prescription. And so it just happens ahead of that unplanned lightning strike. And so as we talk about these managed wildfires, or whatever we want to call them, I think it's important to not call them controlled fires, because they can't necessarily be controlled, but they're under prescription, and it's worth taking that risk.
That's great. How are we doing for time? Carl Struck's got a mastication question out there that you'll probably touch on lightly.
Yep, so we have a couple of minutes, and for anyone who is available to stay afterward, we can keep the discussion going until probably 4:40 or so. So Carl asked, is there a place for chipping or mastication or macetating to support forest soil microorganism health, soil water absorption and retention, and to increase biological triggers for rain nuclei?
I'll take a crack at.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll take a crack at kicking this off. So there's been a couple of robust reviews, but more work is actually needed on the role of mastication and what you get when you do it. And the answer is it depends, from most of the literature that I'm familiar with. If you think about it, it's mastication is often a relocation of fuels, and it depends on what you start with. If the relocation of fuels is massive to the ground, it seems like some work is showing that you can get surface fire behavior that's pretty incredible, and you can get significant mortality of residual trees out of those conditions. In other cases, it's just simply not so. The amount of chipping and mulching that you do produces conditions that are less flammable, and a good treatment is obtained. And so it seems like initial conditions really, really matter. Whether or not it's a good fit, it should be part of the solution set. And if it will result based on measurements of fuel relocation to the forest floor, then it's probably not the best bet.
Okay, thank you for the succinct answer. I'm going to steer us back to public education and public-facing discussions, just recognizing that presenting the facts of forest resiliency in simple, easy-to-understand terms is undeniably important in our line of work. I'm going to take it back to the beginning of your presentation and wondering if you can provide or point to a succinct 1 to 2 sentence explanation of how decades of spatial data show the association between fire exclusion and forest health disruption. Kayala, I'm going to put you on the spot because I think this is very near point presentation.
If I understood your question correctly, I think it's that more fuel and more highly connected fuel changes the way fires operate on the landscape. And it also changes the way ecosystems function. So as Paul mentioned, we're compromising our non-forest ecosystems by maintaining forests at the level of density they're at, which we know is unsustainable, but that's more than 2 sentences. Sorry.
I want to add a sentence, which is that we just have such a privilege to work with incredible scientists and Indigenous knowledge experts throughout the Western US and Canada. Our network of people have amassed decades of evidence that point us to understanding these departures.
Okay, I appreciate that last point too. So I'm going to ask one more question while we wrap things up, and if anyone in the chat has any last minute questions they would like to pose as well, please do so now. Otherwise, I did provide the presenters' contact info, and I'll be sending this recording out to everyone who registered to the webinar in a few weeks. Let's see. So I was just thinking about how you mentioned that forest thinning and fire treatments require regular maintenance, application of prescribed or cultural burning to maintain those low surface fuel levels and remove developing fuel ladders. So in a political landscape where funding for repeat treatments is limited and a social landscape where public support for intentional fire is limited, how can practitioners plan and lay the groundwork for long-term maintenance treatments?
Is it okay if I start on this one, you two?
Do it.
Okay, so I think one of the things that we all could be doing a little bit better job of is celebrating success stories. And so really highlighting cases where managers have done that good work over millennia in some cases, or decades where fires are now not a big deal. They don't put up a lot of smoke. They're not necessarily that hard to contain with a prescribed burn or a cultural burn. And so the success is that we've gotten to the point where we can do maintenance with very less money, less smoke, and fewer resources. Those examples exist and we need to build on them.
I would add to that the prescribed burning programs that have really been active and have multi-decadal depth in the United States, I think they point the way and are very instructive to how we might think about growing the footprint of treatments that are effective at changing the way fire works the landscape. I use my parents as an example. They bought property on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and 50 years ago, when they started burning in the South Coastal Plain and the Piedmont, everybody threw up their hands and they said, "There's smoke." And Dad told me years later, when smoke would go up, they wouldn't even look up from their bridge hands because the public service messages, the working with the public, the dialogue that had been established with the community helped people move into a mindset that the good work that was going on with prescribed burning and repeated burning was keeping them safe, the forest productive in good condition, and providing the services that people grew to expect from those forests. And the people side of this is the most complicated part of the deal. We have a lot of sort of social problems that have an ecological explanation, but the social problem, the solution sets actually live in that social space. So much better communication scientists can do a much better job of developing lay presentations that are short and concise, that get them out of the pages of journals into a space where they can make a difference locally and regionally. And we got to take some of the blame as scientists. We love the comfort of living between the pages of journals. So more experimentation, more working with managers, more working with publics, I think is a really fertile area.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and end it on this note. I really appreciate, again, the discussion. I appreciate you guys coming on and giving this presentation, and I look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. Thank you to everyone who logged on today, and yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks all. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, as well.